Today I will be showing you all how to make a custom wig on a sewing machine. If you're interested in learning, then please stay tuned. Okay everyone, so I'm just going to start out by showing you all the supplies that you're going to need. You will need quite a few things, so I'm just going to show you one by one. So you will need a canvas head. The canvas heads come in differing circumferences. So if you're making it for yourself or for your client, you're going to need the appropriate canvas head. Being that I'm making it for myself, I'll be using a 22-inch. I have a 23. I have 24. They go, I think I've seen as low as 18 or 19 for really small heads and like 25 for larger heads. So I have the 22. You also need some type of comb or brush for brushing the hair out of the way of the closure. You also need some scissors. You'll need some type of cap that you'll be sewing onto. I have different kinds of caps depending on what my client wants. Being that I'm making this unit for myself, I'll be using a mesh dome cap. You can get this at your local beauty supply store, or you can just order it on Amazon. And they do come in two sizes, extra large and regular. I'll be using extra large because I don't want it to fit too snug. I want it snug, but I don't want to have a headache, so I go for the extra large. You'll also need some kind of wig band that you'll put onto the unit once you're done, and that'll just help with additional security. I have different kinds. Again, it depends on what my client wants. I haven't decided yet what I'm going to use for myself, but that won't be until the end anyways. I'll also be using some type of marker. You can have like a metallic marker, and this is what you'll use to draw your guidelines onto your actual unit. I'll be using a wax pencil, a Sharpie brand. I got this on Amazon. It's very important that you have a measuring tape. The measuring tape will ensure that your unit has a custom fit that matches either your head measurements or the client or person you're making the wig for. You'll also need T-pins. T-pins are very important. This will help you to block your measurements onto your wig. You'll also need weaving needles, which will be used for sewing down your closure or frontal. I'll be doing a closure unit. You'll also want to have some type of rubber band or scrunchie, or even some type of clips just to get your hair out of the way when you're sewing down the closure or the frontal. You can also optionally have a spray bottle. I use the spray bottle to get the hair out of the way of the closure and the frontal when I'm sewing that down. Another optional thing to have, but I highly recommend it, especially if you're new to the sewing machine, is a seam ripper. This will save your life. When you use a seam ripper, let's say you accidentally make a mistake when you're sewing, you can easily cut the weft off of the wig cap without ruining the cap. So I would recommend having this. Some type of nylon thread. Well, it doesn't have to be nylon, but I use nylon for sewing down the wig, okay? Also optional are wig combs. I only use these if they're requested by a client. I don't use them on myself. You'll also need, obviously, some hair and a closure or frontal. Today I'll be using 3 bundles of hair, and I'll be using a 5x5 closure. Sorry about that. My memory card ran out of memory. But anyways, we only had one last thing, which is the star of the show, a sewing machine, obviously. You can really use any type of sewing machine. I happen to use the Singer Classic. I haven't had any issues with it. That's what I've been using since I learned how to make a wig on the sewing machine. So that's what works for me, okay? So next I'm gonna show you how it looks when I put the cap onto the canvas head, and I'm gonna block my measurements and begin to draw my guidelines, okay? So I'll be right back. So I've just finished blocking my measurements. I've made wigs for myself so much that I already know what my measurements are. If you don't know your measurements or your clients, then that's why you'll need the tape measure. And it's very important, again, that you are taking accurate measurements. So if you're making the unit for yourself and you don't feel comfortable, maybe you can have someone else take your measurements for you. So the measurements that I use 4 measurements: the circumference, so that's going to be the distance around the perimeter of your head. I also take the front to nape measurement, so that's going to be from the front of your hairline all the way to your nape. I also use the ear to ear, temple to temple. So temple to temple, you're going to measure from where you feel your temple like sink in on the sides of your head. You'll measure from there and to the other side, okay? So you want to make sure it goes right around the back of your head across the occipital bone right here. And then the last measurement is going to be the nape measurement. There are other measurements you can take, like the ear to ear over top, the ear to ear around back, all of that, but these are the 4 that I use when I'm making a closure wig. So then the nape measurement will go from one side of the nape to the other side, okay? So those are the 4. Also, when you're taking your measurements, it's important that your hair is styled in the way that you would wear it under the wig. So you want to make sure your hair is braided flat and neatly, because if your hair is bulky when you take your measurements, and then your hair is not bulky when you put your wig on, the wig is not going to fit right. If your hair is bulky, your measurements are going to come out larger. And then when your hair is actually braided down flat, your wig is going to fit loose, okay? So you want to make sure your hair is exactly the way you would wear it when you have it under the wig, okay? So now that I have all my measurements blocked, the next step would be to get my closure pinned down. I don't sew the closure on until I'm done because it's just easier to not have the hair in my way. So I will pin the closure down first, just so that I know where I shouldn't be sewing, and then I'll make my guidelines, okay? Also, you may find that when you pin your measurement, when you block your measurements, that depending on your head size, you might have extra space. So I left this area so I can show you guys what that would look like. So I'm not sure if you can see here, but I have extra room in the cap, and you want to make sure that you're sewing down this extra room, you're getting rid of it, because when you go to sew it on the machine, you're going to be left with a loose fitting unit, okay? So what I do, I'll show you from the beginning. The wig is just going to look like this when you're done. So what I do is I start from the bottom and I gather all of the extra room. I gather it up. And there are different ways you can do this. I've seen people do it the opposite way, where they gather it down. I gather it to the front because the front is going to get cut anyways when I cut the cap from under the closure. So for me, that works best. So I gather all the hair, all of the cap, until I get to the front, okay? So as you can see here, now the cap is flesh, and it's very taut. What I'll do next is I'll take the T-pin and I will pin this into place, okay? So this is gonna get sewn down, all right? So I'll just show you all what I do really quickly. So I already have my needle pre-threaded, okay? So I start at one side and I will begin to stitch it closed, okay? You don't have to worry too much about how neat it is because again, most of this is gonna be cut if you're wearing a closure and all of it is gonna be cut if it's a frontal, okay? So it really doesn't matter. But this is just to really help you out to make sure that the wig is really fitted to your head, okay? Here I have pinned down the closure and I'm just pinning it down so that I know where I don't need to sew around. Once I have the closure pinned in place, I'll be able to trace around the closure with my Sharpie, and then I can take the closure off and take the cap onto the sewing machine. If you would like a more detailed video about how I actually pin the closure down, please leave a comment below and I'll do that for you. As you can see, I've begun to trace the outline of the closure here. Now I can start removing the T-pins. As you can see, now I have traced the outline of the 5x5 closure, so we can now move on to creating our guidelines. Creating guidelines is fairly simple. It's just important that you keep the line as straight as possible. It will assist you when you take the cap onto the sewing machine by just keeping the lines very straight across. A trick that I use is using the tape measure to measure out the distance between the guidelines. I like to make my guidelines about an inch apart. So I'll measure an inch up from my first guideline and I'll make a small stroke and I'll do that all the way across the head, and then I'll go ahead and connect the line so that I can have one smooth straight line. I have my second guideline, okay? So I'll continue doing this all the way to the top and then I'll come back to show you. I just wanted to come back really quick and show you all my finished guidelines. So as you can see, I just went straight across. My lines aren't perfect, but that's okay. Okay, I have my 5x5 closure marked out, and these are what my guidelines are looking like, okay? So the hair I'm using today, I have 3 bundles of 18 inches. I'm going to start out by doubling the wefts, and I'll probably single the wefts when I get to the top just so that it can be flatter. I have about 10 guidelines here. You can definitely do less. It just depends on how much hair you have, okay? So I'm going to show you all how I get started with doubling these wefts. So I'm about to put this on the sewing machine, but before I do that, I just wanted to give you all another pointer. So these are the pins that were here because I was sewing down the extra space. I can go ahead and remove that now. So these pins here that are around the perimeter of the wig represent the measurements. So up here, this pin is here, and there's another pin in the back which represents the front to nape measurement. There are also 2 pins right here that represent the nape measurement, and then there are these 2 pins right here that represent the temple to temple measurements, okay? So what I do is I leave these pins in their place so that once I come off the sewing machine and I put the wig back on, I could put them back at these same measurements to make sure that the wig is still fitting correctly, okay? Now I am just removing the pins and replacing them from where I took them so that I can take the cap off of the dome. Now we can start the fun part. Here I am beginning to double the wefts. A little tip that I have is that if you are having trouble getting the wefts to meet at the beginning when you try to double, I would say to begin your stitch further down on the weft, and using a back stitch you'll be able to catch the front of the weft, and then you can just do your regular front stitch. I'm using a very light hand to sew. I'm not pulling or tugging, I'm just allowing the sewing machine to do what it does and feed the hair through it. As you can see, I'm simply just holding the wefts together, but I'm not really putting much pressure. I'm simply having my hands there just to hold the 2 pieces together. And the result is a seamless track, tightly sewn together and very neat. I went on to double 2 of the bundles, and then I left the 3rd bundle alone as I got closer to the top of the wig. Now I'm beginning to sew the first track onto the cap. I would say that the first track is pretty much the easiest. You really can't mess it up because you're sewing onto the band. It's a lot sturdier than sewing onto the mesh part of the cap. One thing that you'll always hear is that if you can sew onto a mesh dome cap, you can sew onto any type of cap. That was the first cap that I learned onto. And once you sew onto that, sewing on a ventilated cap is a no-brainer. Again, you want to make sure that you are not pulling on the cap, that you're not stretching it. If you stretch the cap, it will result in ripples and waves on the cap, and it will not be flat. So you just want to help guide the wig cap through the machine. It will move on its own. If anything, you can just have your hand placed there for support. At the end of the cap, I'm just cutting it off at the end, and then I go ahead and back stitch a few times just to reinforce the ending. This will ensure that there is no shedding, and it will just help to ensure a flat finish. Now that I have completed the first track, you can see that I followed the guidelines, and it's very neat and flat, and you really can't go wrong with a good sewing machine made wig. Whenever you sew, you will be left with some strands of thread for whatever reason, so you just want to go ahead and snip those off to make sure that your wig is neat. Now I'm moving on to the second track, and it's the same process. If you want and you have trouble attaching the beginning of the weft to the front of the cap, you can do the same method that you would do if you were doubling the track, which is back stitching a little further down on the cap so that you can catch the beginning of the track and the beginning of the cap, and then go ahead with your normal front stitch. Again, I have my thumb underneath. Using my left hand, I have my thumb just helping to guide and keep the hair on the guidelines, but I'm not pulling, I'm not tugging, I'm just gently gliding it through. Continue the same technique all the way through the top of the cap. Because I made sure that my guidelines were straight, I don't have to worry too much about trying to curve the cap. It makes it a lot easier, especially if you're a beginner sewer. Check in and show you all where I've gotten up to. So I just continued sewing in the same pattern that I had been before. As you can see, all of these wefts are doubled, and then when I got up here, this weft right here is just pinned down, so I can just make sure that I wasn't pulling the cap. I wanted to just test it out. But down here I began singling the wefts because I'm getting closer to the top, as you can see. So yeah, I singled here, and I'm going to continue to single the wefts throughout. I'm almost done. I'm going to sew down this row, and then I'm going to put the closure back on to the cap and actually sew it down by hand. After that, I'm gonna sew around the closure. I'll show you all that, but I just wanted to let you know what I'll be doing on video, okay? So as I mentioned, right now I'm just gonna go ahead and sew down this last track. After that, I'm just gonna have this little section right here to fill in and the closure. And I'll speed this up. I don't want the video to be crazy long, but yep, this is about it, okay? Here I have begun to sew the closure down. If you would like to see a more detailed version of how I pin the closure down, please let me know and I'll make a video about that. taken the wig back onto the sewing machine, what I'm doing here is sewing the last track right below the closure. The track is not on top of the closure, but it is kissing the closure. That will ensure that the wig remains flat, and it will seal off the wig so that the other tracks aren't visible. I'm just making sure that I keep the hair out of the way. Now that I have hair on either side of the cap, it's a lot easier for hair to get into the way of the presser foot. So I'm just making sure I move that and I keep that area clear of any hair. Again, you want to make sure that you are back stitching to close it off and getting rid of any excess strands of thread. As you can see, I have closed off the unit. That final track is right next to the closure, and now it's very flat and has a very seamless look. So I'm just about done with this video. I will make a part 2 showing how I customize the unit if you all are interested. That'll include me cutting the cap from underneath, bleaching the knots, which I do usually do before I make the wig, but this time, for whatever reason, I did not. So that'll include the bleaching, plucking, adding the elastic band inside. But this video is strictly to show you the construction, okay? Hope you all can see the inside. Okay. There's the front, unplucked and unbleached. And I'll put it on the dome. So the pins are still in place. The temple measurement isn't there, but I know where the points were. The nape measurement is there. So when you are done constructing your wig, you want to make sure you put it back onto the dome to make sure that the wig fits. If it fits the dome at the points where you marked off, then you know it's going to fit you or your client's head. Okay? So as you can see here, the cap here is aligned with this part. The temple measurements would have been right here, and it does align with that. And from the back, once you pull the wig down, you'll see that the wig stretches down to meet this point here, and it stretches down to meet this point, as well as the other point on the other side, okay? Right here. The unit is nice and flat. I'll get my brush. As I mentioned, the unit is not styled at all right now. So the front is pretty dense and does need some work. This is a 5x5 closure. Once I add the elastic band, I mean the wig is already gonna fit pretty snug, but once I add the elastic band, it's just gonna pull this down for even more seamless look, okay? So as you can see, the wig is flat. Okay. And yeah, so if you are interested in part 2 of me customizing this unit, please let me know. Thanks for watching.